And so just going back, to, when I said just now, anytime you try to talk about craniosacral therapy, it's not long before we're sort of stumbling on how to communicate it effectively. Because it's
experiential. It's experiential from both sides.
Yes.
If I hadn't experienced it before I heard about it, I wouldn't have believed in it. Because I experienced it first.
Yes.
I know it's real and I know it works. How to articulate that's another story altogether.
Yeah, how to articulate it really is. And it, it's beautiful watching people who come into that articulation and capture a little piece of it. And I think you just did that beautifully. It's experiential. And if it's a reasonable invitation as we chat, just to kind of hold that curiosity, I guess. Just a curiosity, and and just see where we go. Yeah, I'd be interested just to know a little bit about where you are and what brought you into the work. You said you experienced it first, so I'm guessing you went for session before even knowing what you were getting into.
Yes, I had a friend who had studied it, and she studied with the person you mentioned, whose name I've forgotten, in South Africa. The man who's passed away.
Yes.
She was trained by him, and we did it as exchanges. I used to look after her children a lot, and then she gave me cranio sessions in exchange, which was beautiful.
Really beautiful.
And the very first session was just weird. I just thought, this is just weird. Why does anybody pay for something like this? I found myself wanting to experience that weird again. And when she offered me another session, I said, yes, please. And by the second or third session, she just put her hands on my shoulders, and I let go and let go and let go. And I thought that I would actually end up being a puddle under the table. It just made me realize how much I'd been holding myself together, holding my life together. And it was the very first time I had realized that in a physical sense.
Yeah.
And I think from that point on, I was hooked.
That's so beautiful. So you had your session, and then you got curious about the actual work or studying it?
Yes. And then, a bit further along the line, I thought, this is what I want to be able to give back to the world, this whatever it is I'm experiencing. And there's really that desire to return it again.
Beautiful.
Before experiencing craniosacral therapy, I'd been part of a little weekend retreat where completely unprofessional shared massage was involved. So we would just pair up and take turns, about 15 minutes, shoulders or hands or feet or something.
Nice.
And that made me so aware of how deprived our culture is of undemanding touch. That's when I sort of started heading towards this way, wanting to nurture through contact.
Yeah, so of course now we understand very much more clearly why your comment was repeated. Really? Question mark. Yeah, because contact for you is the essence of coming into the work and the reason why.
Yeah.
Totally.
And I continue to feel very sad for all of us that we are so physically deprived of nurturing touch.
Yeah.
And of course, COVID has just exploded that.
Right? Yeah. I mean, the beautiful side of it in this moment is that we are on the furthest possible time zone.
Yes.
Hanging out together.
I know,
which
crazy.
Wouldn't have been able to do, or maybe wouldn't have even thought to do without COVID. And yet at the same time, you're right. It's like that actual physical contact. And you see, I'm English by birth. I live in Hawaii, but I'm English. And one of my friends said the other day, she said, gosh, I can't wait till we can all hug again. And I said, actually, as an English person, I'm loving this because contact is not so natural. I had to learn when I got to Hawaii and everyone starts hugging you. And I'm like, what are you all doing? I had to learn to be comfortable with that. It's going back a long time now, decades, but it wasn't imprinted for me because in England, my friends hug now occasionally, but growing up, nobody had physical contact with friends or, not physical contact with at home would depend on your parents and the style of parenting that they.
And mostly they are brought up in the same culture and they don't, after you're an infant.
Right,
you're
yes.
not touched much.
Yeah.
And a lot of us, even as infants, we're not touched much, which is quite sad, very sad.
Which can be, especially, exactly, if you're raised in that kind of an environment. I was lucky my mother was Irish. And so picking your kids up and hugging them was really a big part of her world. So, yeah. But so beautiful. And then anything else you want to share about your journey with the work or how long you've been on this path?
Well, getting into it, and because it does have lots of association with the energy work field, I did do an energy workshop, part 1, and then COVID hit.
Sure.
And also with somebody really grounded, so I completely trusted her. She's a horse rider and has dogs and cats and geese and ducks and horses. And I experienced very powerful somethings without being touched. And then when I was doing the work on somebody, I could feel that I was feeling where something was wrong in this person. So it was just an intro to it, but there's something, and I wasn't touching her.
Yeah, sure.
I was right there. And we could hug afterwards.
Right. Yeah, but it expanded. I guess in a way that's kind of an interesting progression from what you said initially, which I totally get too. If somebody had just tried to explain craniosacral to me as well at the time that I first experienced it, I wouldn't have gone close. I wouldn't have even gone to the session probably. They're just going to barely touch you for an hour or however long. I'm like, okay, well, that just doesn't even seem worth me taking time to do, right? And so we both kind of probably came in with that awareness and yet experienced it first. And now you brought in doing that energy work where there was a something. And you said something similar about your first experience with craniosacral, like, okay, well, whatever that was, why would anyone pay for it? Which is actually just so beautifully honest, I think. And I love to kind of unload these things because if we don't speak it out loud, then we're not speaking out loud what our clients have somewhere in their psyche as well when they first come to session.
Yeah.
It's sort of a leap of faith or curiosity. Or somebody once said to me, craniosacral is a resort therapy. And I thought they were about to tell me something I'd never heard that would be so enlightening. And I said, well, what do you mean? Because I live where there's a lot of tourism. So I assumed you meant like resort as in tourism. And she said, no, it's like a last resort. It's when they've tried everything else. And they're finally willing to put aside the fact that it makes no rational sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
And just take a chance on something because they're desperately seeking support or healing something. And they're to just put aside that this makes no sense, which is a mental construct, even though it's based on what appears to be reality. As you found out 2 years ago, or whenever you took that energy training class, what appears to be reality is somewhat fluid.
Yeah.
If somebody had said before that, Janet, you're going to feel something in this person's body and you're going to have a knowing about what's going on for them, but you're not going to get close to that person. And you might have gone, you know what, you're dreaming. Right?
Right.
But then in a way, it's like, aren't we doing that every time we do a cranial session as well? You know, we talk about this movement of the sphenoid and the tension patterns in the tentorium and the falx membrane. We never actually physically contact them.
Mm.
We don't actually put our fingers on the sphenoid.
No.
Ever, right? It's not even possible.
Yeah.
I mean, we can
Yeah.
contact with contacts, but we don't contact the bone itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I often think of trying to explain it how I hold my babies all the time. If you're holding a baby, if they're upset and you pick them up, you're automatically kind of doing a sacrum head hold. And just the holding makes their life right. Whatever was wrong becomes right. And you've not done anything except hold.
Yes.
And that makes 100% sense to me.
Yeah.
But when we talk about it with reference to adults, and the complexities of how we've got to where we are, it doesn't anymore seem to make sense.
And yet it does, right? And yet it does. I mean, in a way, I think we're all very brave. We're stepping into this sort of unseen realm of work. No matter how we structure it with our knowing of anatomy and physiology, we're still, for the largest part, not actually contacting any of the structures that we talk about.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what is present there, which is also present in energy work to some degree, I mean, depending on the way that you do it, is intention. You know, when a mother picks up a baby, I worked with children I have worked, I still work with children, but I've worked with children as a nanny, kind of like you did with your friend, for over 3 decades. And I always think with craniosacral therapy, it's the only other time in a person's life that they're held in the way that they were in their mother's arms.
Yeah.
And there's something so foundational about that hold. And the comfort of having the entire central nervous system for an infant be held in mother's embrace.
Yeah. That letting go into the embrace, that feeling safe enough to do that's the huge thing, I think.
That is, yes. Which is where we came in initially as well, is like talking about safety. And it's one of my favorite subjects in this work, because you can't have healing without safety, regardless of why somebody comes to heal, whether they've had a head injury or whether they're healing trauma from childhood or anything in between, or an emotional or a mental relationship to life and existence. If we don't feel safe with each other, we're always containing ourselves. And you're absolutely right. It's beautifully said. It's like in that craniosacral contact, that foundational contact, it's the first time since childhood. If you're safe with your therapist, if you feel safety with your therapist, it's the first time that we've had that foundational contact to the whole central nervous system at one time.
Yeah. Now, how can you do that from Hawaii to here?
Well, that's jumping in at the deep end.
Okay.
And we can jump in at the deep end. We can do that. But the way I was trained in cranial work is to, and that's a little different in every school. My trainer, Wes, he always used to begin with conversation. I know there's certain schools where you just go in, you've got 50 minutes and you're on the table almost immediately within a very short intake. Wes didn't teach that way. He said it's about the relationship. Part of that is because the safety is the foundation to whatever work we do. And if I'm going to go on a craniosacral journey with somebody, I want them to know who I am. I want them to be able to ask questions. I want to invite my clients, and this is just the way I work. It's not necessarily going to resonate or be necessary even for everyone, but it's how I was trained. Just to talk story, which is I guess a Hawaiian phrase that just means just ramble for a minute. and see what comes out of the rambling, because out of the rambling, there will be clues. So we don't have to talk about why somebody came for session. They don't have to talk, well, they could start out, I'm thinking of a particular session. They could talk about why I had an accident, head trauma, I was going this speed, I flew this far, I hit my body in what seems like this order. And within that, there are certain physiological injuries that are needing to heal and resolve. Every time I'd approach the body to look at, okay, where is the body in relationship to the physical trauma, I was given a very clear inner directive, by which I just mean a prompting, that inner prompting that causes us to change our hand position, that very, very subtle imprint that doesn't necessarily have any story. It's just a nudge, you could say.
Yeah, so I often doubt those nudges, and I think, really? Is that really what I'm doing?
I've definitely done that too. And, if I haven't done session for a little while, sometimes I'll come back into it. Does it still work? That's what my teacher Wes used to say. He'd been in practice for a long time, but he said, sometimes you just haven't had your hands on someone for a while, or you haven't been in the work for a while, and you just wonder, does it still work? Because there's not a doing, right? There's not a doing. There's a being present with. And when you come into being present with, you bring all of that knowing, all of that study, all of that learning and knowledge of the physical body. But we know that we can't touch the physical without touching the mental and emotional, because it's a unified field. We can't separate out, oh, I'm just going to work with this. I'm going to work with this physical injury. And so what would come up in this particular session that I was describing was, when I would come to scan for the physical imprints from the injury, the nudging, that silent nudging from the intelligence of the system, we could say, that's one way of saying it, was always what was going through your mind at the time of the accident or just before. And where does that play into your early childhood? Where was the first time you had that feeling? And that opened a doorway that was completely in the realm of mental and emotional and early trauma. And it was through meeting the body at that level that we were able to resolve the physical.
Wow.
And the physical wound up, even though it was such a tangible thing. It was an accident, it was a fall, it was a head injury. And you think, so practical, so physical. And yet the unraveling and the story behind the whole thing went right back to the very first years of life, and an emotional imprint that had come up mentally right before the accident. Yeah.
And yet I can connect. I can relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I started out saying that when I came into this work, I've worked with children for decades as a nanny, as a professional childcare provider. And that was my original training in England. And that's what took me around the world. And when I came into this field of work, I'd also been working in child abuse and domestic violence agencies for several years in Honolulu and on the Big Island and in Chicago. And I came into craniosacral work because I had a session like you did that blew me away. Actually, I'm like, how can you create such a dramatic shift in my being with such a delicate contact and such a very subtle presence? And it's
so little doing.
So little doing. In fact, almost, it's like the more doing, the less we're doing, in a way. And I was just amazed. I'm like, this work is profound. Like I want to offer this out to the world because I don't think people know enough about it. And if we can help people heal at such a deep core level in such a graceful and gentle way, how much does the world need this? a lot.
The world is crying for it. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, Janet, on more now than ever, right?
Yeah, yeah.
More now than ever. And in a way, that's a segue a little bit to perhaps just one aspect of answering your original question, which is if it's possible to create the same healing journey at distance. And obviously I stand in the place of I know it is because I've experienced this for years now. But if it's possible, how many people could be helped that we can't help sitting at home in isolation during quarantine, for example, which we've had on and off over the last 2 years? Is there a way that we could still be of service without having physically met, but meeting at this energetic level, this deeper level of the heart? Because when the mother holds the baby, there's another element there. It's not just that she's contacting the central nervous system by holding the head and the spine. That's a very physical way of looking at what's happening, and it's true. So it's true in our work that we hold that way. But the deeper healing element, in my experience, I would say, and perhaps just also in my approach, is her loving intention is there. The mother's loving intention is there, and the heart is a field of energy as well. So when you hold a child who's crying, the mother has an intention.
Yeah.
To comfort.
That's true.
And we can't comfort from here. I can't mentally think. If I remove the heart completely from the equation, and if I think of someone I have no connection with, they have no connection with me, and they're sad, I can't mentally instill comfort. There's nothing I can say. If I don't bring my heart into relationship with that person, I can't mentally say any words or physically do anything that's going to be comforting unless I bring in the field of the heart. Now, if there's someone who's crying who I don't know, and my compassion is present, and I place my hand on their back and I seriously feel for that soul, then that loving intention begins to flow, and that's the energy healing, like Reiki or other forms of intentional healing. Even with a child, and just kind of like, you could imagine someone very starchy who doesn't enjoy children, holding the child a little bit at arm's length, because they don't really know what to do with children, don't feel a natural tendency towards infants. And you can imagine them being a little bit stiff with that child. The child isn't going to feel the same comfort it feels when you bring it in with
heart.
Right. When you bring the heart into the equation, you have a new field of energy there.
Yeah.
And that field of energy is like it's almost like putting a little pebble in a still lake. It just goes out.
But it does still have the heart and the physical.
Yes. I'm not taking them apart at this point. I'm just bringing in the equation of the heart as part of our work.
I was trying to imagine this by thinking of, a baby. Again, I was thinking the baby is upset and it's in its crib.
Yeah.
And I can't just heart. I need to pick up as well.
You're there in person, and it would be kind of heartless to not pick up, right?
Yeah, definitely, in my view.
So here's what I would say with that analogy, and that's a good question, actually. It's a really valid question. I guess the first thought that comes to me, because I've worked with children for decades as well, is I wouldn't attempt to comfort a crying child at distance and say that that was meaningful. When we work with an adult at distance, or a child who's old enough to, like I have children that I've looked after for, one of them is going to be 9 in a few weeks' time, and the other is just turned 13, but I've looked after them both since they were born. And during the first lockdown, one of them had an injury, and she said, "Do you think I could just have a little bit of time with Bridie?" And I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. I don't usually work with children at distance. And yet we had a beautiful session together, and I was able to find a way in through storytelling, and she loves crystals. I would have her place a crystal on her body, not because the crystals have any inherent energy, although they may, but it allowed her to bring her attention to that part of the body in a very tangible way.
Yes.
With an infant, you don't have that agreement. So to me, part of distance work is a spoken agreement. So I wouldn't, in that analogy of having a baby in a crib, saying, let me call someone who's thousands of miles away and ask them to comfort the child and let's see if it works. I wouldn't even consider that to be a real. But let me tell you how I came into distance work, because I think that might be interesting. Because I came in by mistake, had nothing to do with the pandemic. It was about 10 years ago. And I was working with someone who came for an in-person session. I would say she was in a very profound emotional healing journey. I've never seen anyone shatter so completely and still be functional. And it was very conscious on her part. She knew that there was something that needed to heal that was extremely, like, beyond painful. Like, her physical, emotional body didn't seem to have any way to contain the depth of it. And I only say didn't seem to because as we sat and talked, which I always do with clients first, it was like watching something sort of shatter and fall apart in front of me in the space between she and I. There was almost like another light there. And I'm like, wow, this is almost like watching a kaleidoscope, which I used to love those when I was a kid. But it was almost like the field of the kaleidoscope was in between us. And as she was touching the emotion and the intensity of the emotion, it was like the field was shattering in front of us, or in front of me. I don't know if she could see it, but I'm sure she felt it. And I realized as I brought my heart into relationship with her field that she was barely holding together. And I just started praying, actually. I'm just like, okay, I don't feel like I can even approach her physical body without this tiny amount of containment breaking completely. So it's really tender to touch it. And I just said to Spirit, I'm just like, please show me how to help this person. She so desperately needs help. For some reason, she's come to me. I don't know why, but I trust, like I always work with divine. I'm like, I trust you bringing this person to me, but I don't know. This is not something I've ever come across before, where somebody is barely able to hold themselves. And where I clearly cannot physically walk to the table and put hands on this person without them losing the last part of their control. So it was a little desperate, to be honest, on my part, because I'm like, I can't let her down. I don't want to let her down. She's just shared this tender, tender place that she's in, and she's looking to me for support. And so I'm going to look to my support, which is my relationship with divine.
Conduit.
It's like you can't let her down. You brought her here and allowed her to feel enough trust. And then I just waited the same way that I would wait if I'd gone to the table. And I would come into relationship with her before placing my hands. And I just brought myself into relationship with her field with the containment of my compassion and waited to see what would happen next. And what happened next was her field started to communicate as if I was touching her.
Okay.
We just sat across the room from each other, her in this tremendously fragile, energetic space that felt like it could break at any second, and me hardly breathing because I knew if I got it wrong or brought my mind into play, I could catalyze a negative reaction.
Yeah.
And I just let, like you would with a wild animal or with breaking a horse, for example. You talked about a friend who has horses. If you have a foal that hasn't been handled before, I just let her field come to me and continue to hold and make that space bigger and emptier of my intention, and just created enough safety that her field could reach out very tentatively with the tiniest fragment of stability that she had and find that it was held. And so for the next hour and a half, I just created safety while her field came made contact in a way that became increasingly palpable. And I say palpable because I could start to feel the weightedness of her energy arriving on the palms of my hands, as if I had placed my hands on her feet. And that became like a strong felt sense that had weightedness to it as she came to me. I could feel that arriving of her energy field, which I'd never experienced or thought of or imagined possible, but there it was happening. And at no point did her field invite me to physical contact. It was all right here in the space between us.
And she was on the table and you were...
No, she actually wasn't. We didn't get further than our intake, which was we were sitting across the room from each other. But she clearly, because again, it's like I didn't pick someone off the street and say, we should do this. She had felt called to me. And so when someone feels called to come for session, again, I just give it up into trust to the divine. I'm like, there's some reason that she's, and it's not for me to know. That would be presumptuous of me. I don't know, but I trust. And what I trust is the work, and I trust the spirit, and I trust the wisdom of this soul that has bravely walked through the door with all of her fragility. At the end of an 1.5-hour session, which was all across the room without contact, we were both floored.
And without speech, or were you still communicating?
Well, in subsequent sessions, I've communicated. In that session, there was really no space to communicate. She was so present with her energy body, by which I mean she was just so aware that this fragility was being held. It really wasn't a big speech. I think probably would have been too much. I don't remember speaking to her until the end of session. When I work at distance with people, I do guided, because I want to bring someone into relationship with their inner body, not just the surface of the body. And when we chit chat, that's very much at the level of egoic personality. We're talking at the level of our personality and we're sharing stories, and that's beautiful. But as we talk, the more subtle reason for us connecting starts to arise as a felt sense in the energy field in the way that it did in that room. And when I can feel that, then there's almost like an emanation that comes forward between the client and myself, where I feel them arriving as an energetic and I don't even start session until that happens. And that's true in person as well. And that's, years ago, somebody came for a session when I first started out. I'm a massage therapist as well. And when somebody came for a new session, she hadn't told me during our phone call what she was looking for. And for some reason, it was just a very quick call that she made. So when she got there, I said, well, we better find out. Are you here for massage or cranial? And I didn't say that. I just said, tell me a little bit about what brings you today. And she said, I've no idea. But I heard your name from a friend of mine and I knew that I had to see you. I'm like, oh, and she sounded really urgent about that. So I thought, okay, Bridie, just slow down, because something communicated to her that she doesn't know yet. And it may be helpful to take a little longer on our intake so that we find out and perhaps make it a more conscious journey together. And we talked for about 45 minutes before going into session, which is long.
Oh.
But because for her, there was something that was so urgent that she had to come. And that urgency to me was like a pay attention. It was like a road sign going, slow down, pay attention. There's something really big here. Because her feeling to come was urgent and she doesn't know why. And I don't know why. So again, I just gave it up to the divine. I'm going, okay. When I came to work in this field, I just said, okay, Spirit, I'm like, this is your work. This is the holiest work I know. And these clients that come to me, they're actually yours. And this is just my relationship with Spirit, and, that's not yours. But this was my way of coming in. I said, everyone who walks through that door, you're bringing. And my job is to find out how I can show up in service for that. So all of a sudden, again, it's like her field opened into safety. And that was the first time I realized tangibly what happens energetically when somebody feels safe. There's literally an energetic shifting in the field, and you can feel it in the room as a tangible energy field between myself and the client, where like, oh, they've opened up a layer of their presence into this field of safety. And now I can also feel that there's no way to do massage with this person because we're in a much more subtle space. So clearly we're going to craniosacral. What it turned out was a horrific history of child abuse that had not been verbalized. But if I hadn't taken time before session, we wouldn't have had a container deep enough or safe enough. Wouldn't have known me at all. She wouldn't have had any context of why she was with me or why we were together. She just came in because something unspoken in her said, make a call, make an appointment, go.
Well, you've given me 2 steps of awareness here to work on. When I start my cranio sessions, I start at the feet and I start with contact.
Yeah.
Because I find that the feet is kind of far enough away from the head and the heart that we can make contact safely.
Exactly.
But I am making the contact. But if I now don't make that contact for a while, I can practice sensing that energy body before I make the contact.
Yes.
And open myself to play around with, doesn't seem quite the right word, to experience that. My own anxiety makes me rush in a bit instead of stepping back a bit.
Sure.
So to those 2 things, I can hold an awareness a bit more now.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, and I would say as well, Janet, it's like that anxiety, I totally relate to that, and your client may as well, because if we don't make contact and they're expecting it, to the mind that hasn't yet experienced the work, there can be what is she doing? So we don't want to hold out. I do this when I'm in conversation with people. So as far as they know, we're just having a conversation. With that conversation, I'm completely present for the conversation with all my awareness. But part of my awareness is also holding a more subtle field of attention that is just open to receive whatever else is there to be communicated subtly. Whether that's in the wording, which in the case of this last instance was somebody saying, I knew I had to come, but I didn't know why. And the urgency behind that, even though it was spoken briefly and quickly, I realized there's something here.
Something up here.
And that was for me to capture and to go, Bridie, slow down. Create safety. There's something that she's not aware of that compelled her to be here today, and I'm not aware of it either, and I want to know more about that before I go into session. So I did that during the course of and it doesn't have to be a 45-minute intake. I don't tend to do that with most people, but unless someone comes in with such a level of crisis that I'm aware that we couldn't go into session now anyway, it took everything for them to walk through the door.
Okay.
And after her, and because I'd worked in child abuse agencies for years, Divine started bringing me a lot of clients. I guess I can only assume that because people suddenly started coming, that we'd start out talking about TMJ or not sleeping well or digestive disorders, and within a few minutes they were talking about what happened in school or somebody in childhood or my parent, whatever it was. And suddenly the conversation went from the initial presenting physical condition to something that actually was more pressing for them. And perhaps because I've worked with little children for 30 years and you've worked with children, there's something in that, and you're a mother as well, something in that knowing how to offer safety that perhaps called people who needed safety to come and to feel safe.
to then let go of your jaw. Yeah.
Like, it's holding tension. It's holding tension because perhaps it's holding tension for decades.
Yeah.
Never actually relaxed.
Yeah.
Or somebody's connected, but perhaps they never came into feeling connection because perhaps they came into a childhood that had so much trauma that they never fully came in energetically to the body because it wasn't safe. And that happens a lot. And so we're here, and yet actually they have a beautiful facade that allows them to be functional, underneath which there's a vulnerability and a tenderness that is just aching to be safe enough to express itself.
Yeah. For me, that's the feeling of the whole world at the moment. Like everything about the world is breaking down that facade of what's been set up to be the managing. And it's just not managing anymore.
It's like we put on
as
a speaker, we put on this sort of facade or this mask or this way of living on earth. And you're right. It's completely out of alignment with the deeper wisdom and truth of existence.
Yeah.
And existence is going, it's kind of like a dog that shakes the water up after it comes out of, being in the water. It's almost like existence is just going, I need you to
enough.
It's like shaking us off, going, this is not working. Nature is going, you guys have no connection to the wisdom and the beauty of what is being expressed in a single flower or a leaf or a tree or an animal.
Yeah.
Oh. And yet you look at the indigenous cultures of the world and they know how to live in relationship to the sacredness of life. And what have we done as a sort of domineering culture, the Western civilization, with all of our wisdom, which is beautiful if it's related to existence, come in very controlling, a very money and power oriented species, and we've controlled and contained and marginalized all of those cultures that knew how to live in relationship to the sacredness of life.
And each other.
And each other, right? We've taken their land, we've tried to change their cultures, we've brought in our diseases, we've brought in our containment. We said, you can have this little piece of land, and we're taking the rest. So we've, in a way, I feel like we're being given our sort of karmic comeuppance, really. And in the midst of an invitation to live more the way we do in cranial work, to live in a place of presence.
Presence and receiving.
Yes, exactly. That's a beautiful word.
Receiving from kind of universe and client. It's a flow.
Yeah. And receiving from nature. In the Hawaiians, they know how to enter a forest. Those who are trained in the traditional way, if they go in to pick flowers or they go in to pick plants for their dances, for example, for the hula, where they use certain plants or certain leaves as part of the costumes, they don't drive to the forest and wander in and start gathering. They arrive at the edge of the forest and they offer a chant and a prayer, and they ask permission. And I love that word that you used. It's so sensitive that you use that. They'll receive the essence of the plant with a tree.
Yeah.
They'll meet that.
Beautiful. Yes, we need to go around a bit more with respect.
And recognizing that existence is conscious. At the subatomic level, science now has got there. The ancients have been teaching us for thousands and thousands of years. Now we're starting to catch up a tiny bit. Some can now look at a subatomic level and say, well, if you go into the subatomic level, there's almost exactly nothing there.
Nothing.
Right?
Yeah, I've had that once or twice in a cranio session where it feels like everything's going like melting butter. And I go right in, but at the same time, the more I go in, the less there is. And the more space there is. It's just, I'm sitting there thinking, whoa, now what? But it's like a vastness of space, and yet you've gone in, and supposedly there's getting to be less space, but it isn't like that on the experiential level of being there. Yeah.
Well, we have a number of world-class astronomy labs here, because we have Mauna Kea, our huge mountain here, which is almost 14,000 feet. We have very clear skies. It's like we have a moat around the islands out to the continents that's about 2,000 miles in every direction or more. And so the skies are particularly clear here. And so the astronomers come to Hawaii, amongst other places. So sometimes we'll have talks given in the town where I live by these like world-class astronomers. And one of them that I remember from, years ago now, back in probably 98 or 99, I forget now when it was, but he'd come from, I think he'd just come from Venezuela. He was American, but they had just announced in the scientific literature that week, and he came and was telling us, he said, we're very embarrassed scientifically today because we've just made a public announcement, which is we've been able to look at the universe out to the very edges of the known universe. And we've been tracking this and watching the deceleration of the movement in the atoms going out to the outer edges. And I'm not going to express it perfectly, I'm not a scientist, out to the outer edges of the known universe. I'll just try and capture it. And he said, however, recently, what we've been witnessing, as we would assume that deceleration would continue to get slower and slower, is now there's an acceleration on the very outer edges. And he said, what's embarrassing is we have no idea why, but there has to be a bigger force that's now causing those particles to accelerate instead of decelerate, which means there's something beyond the known universe that is exacting an influence on those particles which were slowing down and is now causing them to accelerate into another space that we don't know. He said, additional to that, we've had to admit that there are particles coming in and out of existence all the time, and we don't know where they're coming from, and we don't know where they're going to, but we can track them for the brief moment that they are in existence. And he said, they're in this room right now. We're in this huge auditorium. He said, there are particles coming in and out of existence in this room as we're speaking that we can now measure. We don't know where they've come from. We don't know where they go, but we still hold that matter can't be destroyed. And so there's somewhere, some plane of existence that is not measurable to us yet.
Parallel universes. I love it.
Right. So, it's like if we allow ourselves to stay in curiosity, we also allow ourselves to stay fluid, and we allow ourselves to keep learning. I can stay grounded and curious. Like for you.
And I think of leaving a little window open somewhere for the possibility, even if I don't know now, leave it open.
Exactly, Janet. And you're an intelligent woman, and so you're going to put any new information through the filter of your wisdom and through the filter of your curiosity, but also through the filter of, okay, well, that's a nice idea, but I don't experience that, so therefore I don't necessarily have access to it, and it may not even exist, but at least I have something that I can be, like you said, like a tiny little bit curious about. And as I shared with that first story, I didn't ever set out to do distance cranial work. It would never have occurred to me that it was meaningful or possible.
Have you done any sessions like this?
For about 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And the client is seated or lying, or?
Start out with conversation the way I would do if they were here in person.
Yeah.
And that conversation doesn't have to be focused on their specific intention, although it will usually include that. But I invite it to get a little bit broader because, again, I want to let them get to know me. I'm also, whether I'm in person or at distance, I'm always looking for their field to invite me in first. And so,
yeah. I mean, I've met somebody on Zoom, and we've just been having wonderful conversations. And there is that sense. I mean, from the very first Zoom, there's a kind of an energy, and you pick it up from all the different people on the Zoom, and you send out lots of sort of connecting links, but one in particular will respond, and it grows from there. So I can see it all in that context. But for somebody who's got that stiff shoulder or needing to be held, can it work for that as well? Is what you're saying makes sense.
I think we also have to look at what's behind, as you said earlier, what's behind the stiff shoulder.
Yeah, quite.
When I had the client have the physical accident where she'd hit her head, incredibly painful, very physical, very tangible impact, and yet her system wouldn't let me go straight to the physicality of the healing. It just kept prompting or nudging me to ask a question. What were you feeling at the time just before this happened? And when was the first time you felt that? When's the earliest time you had that feeling? And we immediately wound up in an early trauma story that had reflected itself. And so that comes into working with trauma, which is a slightly different conversation. And that comes into a way that feels so resonant for me now, which is that our earliest imprints of how we are received into life. You know, this image with your children, how we are received in life, what those early imprints for us are in our first family, in the first 0 to 2, 0 to 5, 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years. What the story is in that first part of life really sets up our blueprint of how we meet existence, how we meet life. Am I loved? Am I safe? Am I respected? Am I honored? Am I seen? Am I held? Is there a space for me in life? Is somebody here for me? Or am I just, off in the distance here while everyone's busy with something else and it's just give her another toy? That sets up how we meet life. We're here as souls, ultimately. And that's, again, a bigger conversation, but this is why I love cranial work so much, because we're not here just as human beings having a 60, 70, 80-year experiment and then we're gone. We're here as part of a continuum as souls that are here to dissolve all of our sort of external structures back into the oneness of being. And if we can help somebody resolve the external structure, particularly of trauma, which is such a deep imprint, that it then sets up our mental structure of how we meet life, our emotional structure of how we interact with each other. If we can help somebody resolve at that level and become that sort of fluidity, that openness, that spaciousness that we all actually are, because you and I were just a mass of billions of empty spaces called atoms. And if we can help somebody experience themselves in that way, they make, I think, an experiential step towards experience the truth of their existence, which is non-physical.
Yeah.
It's not that we're going to stop living in the world. We're not going to stop wanting that hug, but it gives us a chance to experience the depth of why we're actually here.
That it's bigger. Yeah, there's that sense that It's not confined to this small, tight human.
Forbid. And yet we get a lot of physical contraction that reminds us we're very, very physical. And oftentimes those physical contractions will mirror back to a set of beliefs and emotional patterns that keep coming up in different forms throughout life, from early childhood all the way through. And that impression gets stronger and stronger as we get further from childhood. It's almost like the soul is trying to go, love that you're having this physical experience, but could I remind you of why you came?
We refuse to get reminded, and we keep it.
Gosh, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. I'm busy doing all these things. It's like, well, you didn't come to do. You came to be. You have another
Yes,
reason.
yes.
You didn't come to do. We're also busy
being.
How to be, and the indigenous cultures knew how to be. And all of this together, all of these different elements and facets that we're touching on are part of a much deeper wisdom of existence, which is we're essentially energy beings, we're essentially divine consciousness in a human form. Essentially, there is no Janet, there's no Bridie, there's just this consciousness. And in my form, we were pulled together like little like little magnetic pull that called us together for conversation today. And the deepest gift out of that is that we start to remember who we really are.
Yeah, we remember the magic of something.
It's almost like going off on an adventure as a young child with your little knapsack on your shoulder, and you wander off into this beautiful, great world. You have all of these adventures, and then you suddenly remember you only went out to get milk, and you were supposed to bring it. And decades have gone by now, and you suddenly, this little light bulb goes off. You're like, oh my gosh, I just went to get milk. Let me get the milk. Home again. Now we're back at home. At home is this field of infinity, this field of divine consciousness that is actually who we truly are.
Yeah.
Come to experience that. And in craniosacral, as you experienced in those sessions where you could feel the dissolving into the vastness. I always think, there was one video that I made. It's so funny. I shouldn't be making videos at all. I was so very self-conscious, but I get so excited about this work that I couldn't help it. A couple of years ago, I was so excited at the end of the day, I just started recording something. So it's easier for me than writing it down. It's faster. And I don't have to slow down to think of the words. So I recorded this video, and I'm like, oh my gosh, here we are looking out like the astronomers that live just down the road from me here. We're looking out at the outer edges of space. And in meditation, or in exploration of consciousness, or in craniosacral therapy, we have this beautiful way of going inward. We've got an entire universe in here because there's no boundary line to it. And the only boundary line we have is the physical body. And here we are between these polarities of existence, the physical realm out there, and the stars and the cosmos and the planets and the billions of suns, and then going inward into the space that has no boundary line because there is nothing there except consciousness. And we experience on this field, the field of the senses.
Having had that experience, I can sort of imagine that vast, because it is a universe, that we can still connect. But I did that via contact, and I can't imagine doing that with you, say, with this technology.
Sure.
But I'm going to play around a bit now. When I get it.
The only way it would become meaningful is if you have a direct experience of it, of course. The same as with The only way craniosacral became meaningful was to have a direct experience. If you
Yeah.
stay in the mental construct of I'm here looking at a computer screen, then I'm just going to be here looking at a computer screen. That's all that's going to happen. If I enter into a possibility,
then it could be something else.
That I'm actually meeting with Janet right now. What a gift. And I'm meeting with the wholeness of you, not just this flat image. So if I allow myself to actually enter into that meeting, even just for a moment, we can play with it if you want to, just to enter into the possibility of actually just like, here we are together. We don't have to call it distance. We don't have to call it a computer. We don't have to call it a flat image. I could enter into the delicious gift of meeting your heart and personality and intellect and this delightful person that you are. Now, if I allow myself to meet you in that way, suddenly I step out of the mind a little and drop into the heart, and I can feel my body differently now because I'm coming into relationship with a meeting. And I'm not meeting you here through energy going out through the eyes. I pull back in the way that I would in a cranial session into receiving you rather than going out, and just create a space with an invitation to receive that meeting. Then we're meeting on the level of just conversation right now. But if we were meeting with a deeper intention to explore a healing presence, then that part of you that communicates as a client, or that part of your client that it communicates through a touch, which quite frankly is almost nothing. And yet it allows my mind to feel like I'm doing something. It allows my mind as a practitioner to feel like I'm present. It allows my mind to feel like.
But it's not just that. There is something beneficial about touch.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. We're not negating that. We're not negating.
Yeah.
Not negating that. This is not either or. This is just possibly exploring an additional element that at least a potential. And you may never need to explore that, because fairly soon this whole episode that we're going through may go back to normal, and can't wait to have all of our clients coming back and freely in the way that we have in the past. But say, for example, you had someone that you cared deeply about in the other part of the world who was going through something, and you knew how to be present for them in a way that was meaningfully transformational for that person. The thing is, when your field starts to communicate therapeutically with me, I'm given an imprint of which way to hold your body and where the contacts are. I'm also given the imprint of the fluid movement in the craniosacral system. And when you're to change position, there's an imprint given of where the next hold is. So I have a space here that is the holding space of the body. And it shows an unwinding and an unfolding, and it will start to show the unwinding in the fascia and the fluidic movement in the cranial system. And it shows up as an imprint on the hands in the same way that it would if I had my hands on.
Yeah. You also said something very relevant, I think, about doing it like this. We only have so many hours in a day, and the world is big and there are millions of people who need support in this way, and it's almost my duty from the universe.
How selfish to have this tool available.
Yes, and to not do it. Yeah.
Lock inside four walls and go, I can't possibly expand my sense of what's possible, because that would freak me out. Or it would shift my paradigm in a way that I'm not comfortable with.
Yeah.
Of course, that's everyone's allowed to do that. We're all allowed to make a personal choice around that.
Just irrelevant that voices say nonsense and woo-woo, and it's my duty to actually work on developing my ability to help where help is needed.
Yeah, if you're called to it, there'll be people who will only ever want to do hands-on work. And mentally, the construct will be, particularly trained or perhaps by a mechanical way, that feels really at home there, feels really comfortable there, and isn't remotely comfortable with having a window open. In fact, the window's closed because that wouldn't be comfortable. I have respect for that. It's what are we, life is really, to me, is like, what are we called to? That calling isn't a mental idea that I have. It's an impulse from existence that says, take this path, go that way, explore this avenue. And I always do that with a critical mind. When I met my first spiritual teacher, I didn't even want to meet him, quite frankly. I threw his number away, or at least I thought I did. I wasn't very effective. I threw behind the trash can. I'm like, I'm not meeting this person just because somebody thinks he's like all that. I'm like, no, I've traveled all over the world looking for truth and reality, and I'm calling off the search. Quite honestly, I've looked under every stone I could find for decades. Get me behind me. I don't want to meet this human being. It's like no more fake, false, wannabe pretending. I'm like, no. I was in a major crisis in life, and I'm like, I cannot meet another person who thinks they're like have the answer.
Please no.
And after 3 months of having thought I'd thrown it away, the piece of paper had fallen behind the trash can. Obviously, I didn't mentally know that, but after 3 months of thinking I'd thrown it away, I was at work one day and realized if I didn't meet him immediately, I probably wasn't going to make it. I hadn't thought about him in 3 months. I didn't know who he was. I couldn't even remember his name. Someone just told me, oh, you should meet this person. I'm like, I don't think so. It's the last person I want to meet now. Now that you're telling me I should, it's the very last person I want to meet.
Yeah.
And I had to leave work within a split second of having that realization because it was urgent.
Sure.
And I drove home. I don't think my tires touched the road. It's like I literally flew. I went straight to the trash can, moved it, and there was the number on the floor right behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, the universe can override any of our decisions.
Yeah, because I mean, who's making these decisions? Which atom has enough structure for making these decisions? Which atom has enough structure to like contain us in the physical? There isn't. It's all consciousness, and that consciousness is like a universal field. It's like Rumi said, beyond right doing and wrong doing, there's a field, we meet there. And that field is a field of beingness. And when we're brave enough to peek over the wall and glimpse that field of beingness and start to just like get with that a little bit, and just say, okay, I can only get with it a touch. Okay, just get with it with a touch, just allow a possibility. We don't have to push ourselves out of our comfort zone because we're meant to use the intellect. We're meant to use our wisdom and discrimination. Those are beautiful tools. So we don't want to throw them away just because somebody says something. Certainly not because I say something, but every time we do that, we allow ourselves to inhabit a slightly freer space. And all of a sudden, life doesn't feel very mysterious anymore. All of it starts to make sense. The thought that this person had, or this accident that reflected back all the way through life and made total sense of why the accident happened, that was actually a pointer going, go back to the beginning, clear the emotional field around the original imprint so that life doesn't have to keep creating reminders to go back and take care of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Bridie.
You're so welcome.
I would
Janet.
love to chat with you again.
Late at night for you, and I really honor your time and your curiosity.
I honor you, your time and giving.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So very, very much.
I feel passionate about it because this work gets to the heart of existence. It really does.
Yeah, it feels like it to me.
So,
yeah.
You may have more questions, and I'm happy to, we could meet this way another time if it feels resonant for you.
Love to. I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Such a joy to meet you. Really, such a joy. Take care.
No, more than just a photograph when I see the posts.
Exactly. Likewise. Now to feel your heart. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Take good care.
Good night, Bridie.
Good night.
This is the hardest part of Zoom. Is just that gone, leave, nothing.
Well, over leaving is the image. In session, we consciously pull out of that contact at a certain point, or it pulls from us, and we allow it to, the client will recede back into themselves. So we just allow it to be gentle. It doesn't have to be, the image goes, but we don't have to cut the heart connection instantly. We can just let that take its time and just carry to sleep. And, we got to make a new friend today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good morning. Beautiful day to you. Bye.